Before we begin tonight's terrifying true story, I want you to think about the last time you worked alone at night or found yourself in a brightly lit place surrounded by complete darkness. That feeling of being watched, even when you can't see anyone out there. Tonight's story comes from Jake, a college student who took a night shift job at a 24-hour gas station on Highway 95 in Nevada. What started as an easy way to earn money while studying became a nightmare that still haunts him today. As I tell you Jake's story, remember that this really happened, and it could happen to anyone who finds themselves alone in the middle of nowhere when the sun goes down. My name is Jake, and I used to think working the night shift at a gas station was the easiest job in the world. Highway 95 cuts through the Nevada desert like a black ribbon, and our station sat right in the middle of absolutely nothing. The nearest town was 40 miles in either direction, which meant most nights I'd see maybe 5 customers between my 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. It was perfect for studying, or so I thought. The pay was decent, the work was mindless, and I had 8 hours of quiet time to get through my engineering coursework. The station was one of those newer builds with floor-to-ceiling windows, bright fluorescent lighting, and a decent security system with cameras covering every angle. During my first week, my manager Brad had shown me the monitor behind the counter that cycled through all 12 camera feeds. "These babies record everything," he'd said, tapping the screen. "Corporate can even check in remotely if they want. You're never really alone here." That comment had seemed reassuring at the time. The first month went exactly as I'd expected. Truckers would stop for coffee and energy drinks, the occasional local would grab cigarettes, and sometimes people driving cross-country would fill up and stretch their legs before continuing into the desert. The isolation actually felt peaceful. I'd prop my textbooks on the counter, work through problem sets, and enjoy the steady hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of highway traffic. The desert outside looked like an ocean of darkness beyond our little island of light, but it never felt threatening. I was safe behind thick glass and steel with my car parked right outside and my phone always charged. What could go wrong in a place where everyone could see everything? It was a Tuesday night in October when things started to change. I remember the exact date because I'd been cramming for a midterm exam, and I had my notes spread across the counter when I heard the electronic chime of the front door. It was just past 3 a.m., that dead hour when even truckers are pulled over sleeping in their cabs. I looked up to see a tall man in a dark hoodie walk through the entrance. He was probably in his 30s, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with his hood pulled low over his face. Nothing unusual about that. People wear hoodies in the desert at night because it gets cold. But instead of heading toward the coffee machine or browsing the aisles like every other customer, he stopped just inside the door and turned to look directly at the security camera mounted in the corner. He stood there for at least 30 seconds, perfectly still, staring up at that camera. I cleared my throat and called out the standard greeting. "Evening? Let me know if you need anything." He didn't respond or even acknowledge that I'd spoken. Instead, he walked slowly along the wall, stopping at each security camera and looking directly into it for several long moments. The way he moved was deliberate, methodical, like he was taking inventory of our surveillance system. My textbook lay forgotten on the counter as I watched him make this strange circuit around the store. The refrigerator's humming seemed louder suddenly, and I became very aware of how isolated we were out here. After examining each camera, he walked to the magazine rack near the front window and stood with his back to me, appearing to browse. But in the reflection of the window glass, I could see he wasn't looking at the magazines at all. He was watching me, and he was watching the security monitor behind my counter. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick to the monitor's reflection, studying which camera angle was currently displaying. I felt my heart rate pick up and tried to focus on my homework, but the numbers and equations might as well have been written in a foreign language. Something about this guy's behavior was setting off every alarm bell in my head. 20 minutes passed like this. 20 minutes of him standing there, occasionally picking up a magazine and putting it back, but mostly just watching. Watching me, watching the cameras, learning the layout of our security system. I'd never had a customer spend that long in the store without buying anything, especially not at 3 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. Finally, I decided I had to say something. Company policy was to offer assistance to customers who seemed to be having trouble finding what they needed. I walked out from behind the counter, my legs feeling strangely weak, and approached him as casually as I could manage. "Hey there, can I help you find something specific?" I asked, trying to keep my voice normal and friendly. He turned around slowly and for the first time I got a clear look at his face. He was pale with deep-set eyes and hollow cheeks, but it was his expression that made my blood run cold. He was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of smile you might give someone when you know a secret they don't, when you know something terrible is about to happen and you're looking forward to it. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet I had to strain to hear him over the store's background noise. "You work here alone every night?" he asked. Before I could answer, he continued, "You ever think about what would happen if something went wrong out here? How long it would take for someone to find you?" His eyes never left mine as he spoke, and I felt like a mouse being studied by a snake. I managed to stammer something about having good security and people checking on the store regularly, but he just kept smiling that awful smile. Then he asked the question that still gives me nightmares. "You think you'd be afraid to die alone?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and my hands started shaking. He stared at me for another few seconds, that horrible smile never wavering, then walked past me toward the exit. At the door, he paused and looked back. "See you around, Jake." The sound of my name coming from his mouth made my knees buckle. I'd never told him my name, and I wasn't wearing a name tag. The electronic chime sounded as the door closed behind him, and I watched through the window as he walked out into the parking lot and disappeared into the darkness beyond our lights. I spent the rest of my shift checking and rechecking the locks, jumping at every sound, and constantly scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. The security cameras that had once made me feel safe now felt like a joke. He'd studied every single one, probably figuring out their blind spots and limitations. When my relief arrived at 7 a.m., I was so rattled that I could barely give him the report on the night's sales. I drove home in a daze, double-checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, half convinced I'd see a dark hoodie following me. That day I couldn't sleep despite being exhausted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile and heard his whisper, "You think you'd be afraid to die alone?" The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed this job to pay for school, and I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the guy was just weird. Maybe he was on drugs. Maybe I'd imagined how threatening he'd seemed. People say strange things at 3 a.m., right? I arrived at 11 p.m., determined to put the whole incident behind me and focus on my studies. Brad was just finishing up the evening shift when I walked in, and he seemed unusually concerned about leaving me alone. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as he counted out the register. I almost told him about the previous night, but decided against it. What would I say? A customer asked me weird questions and knew my name? It sounded paranoid even in my own head. The first few hours passed normally. A few truckers, a family driving through the night, normal highway traffic. I started to relax and even managed to get some studying done. But as 3 a.m. approached, I found myself glancing at the parking lot more frequently, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond our circle of light. Every set of headlights that passed made my pulse spike, and I kept imagining I saw figures moving in the shadows. When 3 a.m. came and went without incident, I felt foolish for being so paranoid. Maybe the guy had just been passing through, never to be seen again. At 3:47 a.m., I looked up from my textbook to see him standing outside the front window. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything except standing there in the parking lot, maybe 10 feet from the glass, staring directly at me. The same hoodie, the same pale face, the same terrible smile. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized he must have walked up while I was focused on my homework, moving silently across the asphalt to position himself where the cameras couldn't see him clearly. He raised one hand and waved at me slowly, like we were old friends. Then he pointed at his watch and mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I fumbled for the phone behind the counter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. But who was I going to call? The police? And tell them what? That a man was standing in our parking lot? That wasn't illegal. He wasn't trying to break in or threatening me directly. He was just standing there watching. But somehow that felt infinitely more terrifying than if he'd been screaming or pounding on the windows. This was calculated, patient, predatory. For 45 minutes, he stood there. Sometimes he would walk a slow circle around the building, always staying just at the edge of where the security cameras could get a clear shot of his face. Other times, he would press his face close to different windows, cupping his hands around his eyes to peer inside. I could hear his fingernails tapping against the glass as he moved around the perimeter, a soft scratching sound that made my skin crawl. Whenever I moved to a different part of the store, he seemed to anticipate it, repositioning himself so he could maintain eye contact. It was like being watched by a predator that was learning my patterns, studying my behavior for some future purpose I didn't want to imagine. When he finally disappeared back into the darkness, I was too shaken to do anything but sit behind the counter and stare at the door until my relief arrived. I didn't even pretend to study for the rest of my shift. Every shadow outside looked like it might be him. Every sound made me flinch. The fluorescent lights that had once seemed bright and protective now felt like a spotlight illuminating me for anyone watching from the dark. I was trapped in a fishbowl, visible from every angle, with nowhere to hide. The third night was when I discovered the footprints. I'd arrived early and was doing the routine security check that Brad had taught me during my first week. Lock all the doors, check the register, make sure the cameras are working, walk the perimeter to look for any damage or suspicious activity. It was that last part that made my blood turn to ice water. In the soft dirt around the building, I found footprints, lots of them. They circled the entire station, coming close to every window, every door, even the service areas where deliveries were made. Some were fresh from the previous night, but others looked older, partially filled with wind-blown sand. He'd been watching me for weeks, maybe since my very first shift. All those peaceful nights when I thought I was alone, when I felt safe in my bright little island in the desert, he'd been out there in the darkness, learning my schedule, studying the building, planning something that I was too afraid to imagine. I followed the trail of prints with a sick fascination, and what I found made my hands shake so badly I dropped my flashlight. Behind the building, near the employee entrance that I used every night, the footprints were deeper and more numerous. He'd been spending a lot of time back there, hidden from the highway, hidden from the security cameras, watching the door where I came and went. But it was what I found stuck to that back door that nearly made me quit on the spot. A piece of paper, folded once and taped to the metal at eye level. My name was written on the outside in block letters, and my hands were trembling so badly I could barely unfold it. Inside, in the same careful handwriting, were just 4 words: "Today is the night." I called the police immediately, finally having something concrete to report. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes, which felt like a miracle given how isolated we were. They took the note seriously, photographed the footprints, and reviewed what footage they could from the security system. But the cameras had blind spots, just like I'd suspected, and the footage from the previous nights showed only unclear shapes moving at the edges of the frames. The officers promised to increase patrols in the area and advised me to call immediately if the man appeared again. One of them, a veteran cop named Martinez, pulled me aside as they were leaving. "Look, kid, I've seen this kind of thing before," he said quietly. "This guy isn't just some harmless weirdo. He's escalating, getting bolder, making contact. You need to take this seriously. Is there any way you can get someone to work with you, at least for a few nights?" I explained that the station only employed 2 people for the night shift, and the other guy was on vacation. Martinez frowned and shook his head. "Then maybe it's time to call in sick until we can figure out who this guy is. Your safety isn't worth the minimum wage." But I couldn't afford to miss work, not with tuition due and my car payment coming up. I convinced myself that now that the police were involved, the guy would back off. Maybe he was just trying to scare me and would move on now that he knew I'd taken it seriously. As the officers drove away, leaving me alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, I tried to feel reassured by their visit. But deep down, I knew they couldn't watch the station 24 hours a day, and he could be out there right now, waiting for them to leave. The night started normally enough, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every customer who walked through the door made me tense up. Every car that slowed down outside made my heart race. I kept the phone within reach and had the local police number programmed into my cell phone. The security monitor seemed to mock me with its rotating views of empty parking lot and dark highway. At 2:30 a.m., I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The monitor had gone black. Not just one camera, all of them. The screen showed nothing but darkness where 12 different camera feeds should have been cycling. I frantically pressed buttons on the control panel, trying to reset the system, but nothing happened. According to the manual Brad had shown me, this could only happen if someone with administrative access had remotely disabled the system, or if the main cables had been cut. My mouth went dry as I realized what this meant. Either corporate had chosen this exact moment to perform some kind of maintenance, which seemed unlikely at 2:30 a.m., or someone had figured out how to disable our security system from the outside. I was completely blind now, unable to see what was happening around the building. For all I knew, he could be right outside any of the windows, and I'd never know until he chose to reveal himself. The sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like insects crawling on my skin. I called the police emergency line, my voice barely steady enough to explain what was happening. The dispatcher promised to send a unit, but warned it could be 20 minutes before they arrived. 20 minutes. Felt like an eternity when you're trapped in a glass box, with no way to see what's lurking in the darkness outside. At exactly 3 a.m., the power went out. Not just the lights, everything. The refrigerators stopped humming. The electronic systems went silent. Even the red LED display on the coffee machine disappeared. The only illumination came from the dim glow of my phone screen and the distant headlights of passing cars on the highway. But those cars seemed fewer now, and the spaces between them stretched longer and longer until I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen traffic. In the sudden quiet, every small sound became amplified. My own breathing sounded thunderous. My heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo off the walls. I fumbled for the flashlight we kept behind the counter, my hands shaking so badly I knocked over a display of gum. The beam of light felt pitiful against the overwhelming darkness, creating more shadows than it eliminated. As I swept the light across the windows, trying to see outside, I caught a glimpse of movement near the far corner of the building. Just for a second, a dark shape that seemed to duck out of view when the light hit it. My throat constricted, and I had to fight to breathe normally. Then I heard the tapping, soft, rhythmic, deliberate, fingernails against glass, just like the second night, but now coming from multiple directions. He was moving around the building, tapping on different windows as he went, letting me know exactly where he was while staying just out of sight. The sound seemed to circle the building slowly, methodically, like he was performing some kind of ritual. Tap, tap, tap on the front windows. A pause, then tap, tap, tap from the side. Moving to the back of the building where I couldn't see, then emerging on the other side to continue his horrible circuit. My phone showed no signal, which had never happened before. Even out here in the middle of nowhere, we usually had at least one bar. I realized he must have some kind of signal jammer, probably the same equipment he'd used to disable the security cameras and maybe even cause the power outage. This wasn't random harassment or a crime of opportunity. This was planned, sophisticated, and I was completely cut off from any possibility of help. The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, I strained to hear anything that might tell me where he was or what he was doing. My flashlight beam darted frantically from window to window, but I saw nothing except my own reflection staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. The silence stretched on, becoming more oppressive than the tapping had been. At least when I could hear him moving around, I knew where he was. Now he could be anywhere, doing anything, preparing for whatever he'd been building up to all this time. I heard the back door handle rattle, the employee entrance I used every night, the one where he'd left the note, the one surrounded by all those footprints. The handle turned slowly, testing the lock, and I heard the soft squeak of metal under pressure. I'd locked it during my security check, I was sure of it, but now I couldn't remember if I'd actually tested the handle or just assumed it was secure. The rattling stopped, followed by a soft scratching sound like someone was working on the lock with tools. That's when I realized I had to run. I couldn't wait for the police, couldn't hide behind the counter, hoping he'd give up and leave. He'd disabled the security system, cut the power, blocked my phone signal, and now he was working on getting inside. Whatever he'd been planning for all those weeks of watching and waiting, tonight was the night he'd chosen to do it. I grabbed my car keys and my phone, hoping I might get a signal once I was away from whatever jamming device he was using. The front door seemed impossibly far away, and I knew that opening it would trigger the electronic chime that would announce my escape attempt, but I had no choice. I turned off my flashlight, hoping the darkness would provide some cover, and moved as quietly as I could toward the entrance. Each step seemed to echo through the silent store, and I was sure he would hear me moving around inside. My hand was on the door handle when I saw him. He was standing directly in front of the main entrance, just a few feet away on the other side of the glass. Even in the darkness, I could make out his silhouette and that terrible smile gleaming in the faint starlight. He'd been waiting for me to try exactly this, positioning himself where he could cut off my escape route. When our eyes met through the glass, he raised one finger to his lips in a shushing gesture, then pointed toward the back of the building. The scratching sounds had stopped, which meant he'd either given up on the back door or successfully gotten through the lock. I was trapped between him at the front entrance and whatever might be coming through the employee door behind me. My legs felt like water, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the linoleum floor. But then I heard something that gave me hope. The distant sound of a car engine getting closer. The police, finally responding to my earlier call, or maybe just a random traveler who might help if I could somehow signal them. The man in the hoodie heard it too, and his smile faltered for the first time. He glanced toward the highway, then back at me, and I saw something like frustration cross his features. Whatever he'd planned to do, tonight, he needed privacy to do it, and the approaching car was disrupting his timeline. He stepped back from the window and melted into the shadows so quickly, I almost wondered if I'd imagined him. But the memory of that smile, that finger pressed to his lips, would stay with me forever. The approaching headlights belonged to a police cruiser, and I've never been so grateful to see flashing red and blue lights in my life. Officer Martinez stepped out with his hand on his weapon, scanning the area with a powerful flashlight. I pounded on the glass and shouted that I was inside, and he quickly helped me unlock the front door. My legs gave out as soon as I was outside, and I collapsed onto the pavement, shaking uncontrollably as everything I'd been holding in came pouring out. They found evidence of tampering with both the power lines and the security system cables, confirming that this had been a coordinated attack rather than random equipment failure. The back door lock showed scratch marks consistent with lock-picking tools, and there were fresh footprints all around the building. But despite an extensive search of the surrounding desert and a statewide alert, they never found the man in the hoodie. He'd vanished as completely as he'd appeared, leaving behind only the evidence of his presence and the memory of that horrible smile. I quit that job the next day and never worked alone at night again. Even now, years later, I can't drive past a 24-hour gas station there without feeling my heart rate spike, especially if it's isolated and brightly lit against the surrounding darkness. I've moved to a different state, changed my phone number, and done everything I can to make sure that night stays in the past where it belongs. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I think I hear fingernails tapping against my windows, and sometimes, just for a moment, I catch a glimpse of a dark hoodie in my peripheral vision before it disappears. The thing that still haunts me isn't just what happened that night, but what was supposed to happen. He'd been planning something for weeks, studying my routine, learning the building's security weaknesses, preparing for the night when everything would be perfect for whatever he intended to do. The note he left said, "Today is the night." But what exactly was supposed to happen when the power went out and the cameras stopped recording? What was he planning to do once he got through that back door? I've never wanted to know the answer to those questions, but they follow me anyway, especially during those late hours when the rest of the world is asleep. If you work alone at night, especially in isolated places, please take your safety seriously in ways I didn't until it was almost too late. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't dismiss strange behavior as harmless, and never assume that bright lights and security cameras are enough to keep you safe. The most dangerous predators are the patient ones, the ones who watch and plan and wait for the perfect moment when you're completely vulnerable. They know that places like gas stations and convenience stores are designed to be accessible with large windows and multiple entrances, making them perfect hunting grounds for someone with the right skills and the wrong intentions. Stay alert out there and remember that you're never as alone as you think you are. Sometimes that's comforting, but sometimes, like that night on Highway 95, it's the most terrifying thing in the world.